Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with Richard Swinburne, the distinguished philosopher of religion, a retrospective of his views and arguments over his illustrious career, including his books, The Existence of God and The Coherence of Theism. Richard is Emeritus Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion at the University of Oxford. Richard, it is really good to see you again, though I would have preferred to be with you at Oxford as we had done prior.
Thank you very much, but I appreciate this occasion.
Richard, let's start by describing the arc of your remarkable intellectual and spiritual journey, the sequence of topics in your pursuits in philosophy and the philosophy of religion.
Yes, I've always been religious, but in my teenage years, I began to be conscious that the intellectual climate was moving a bit against religion, and I felt the need for arguments, because all that theologians and preachers said is, well, it's a matter of faith, and that's that. I thought that's not good enough. So I was studying philosophy at the time as an undergraduate with other subjects, but philosophy was what, in your terminology, I majored in. And although I didn't like very much the kind of philosophy then being taught, I realized that philosophy had tools of clarity and argument which could help to provide such justification. And I also thought that the paradigm of knowledge in the modern world was science. If you could show that something was scientific, that showed it was a justified belief. But I didn't know much science, to say the least. But I was fortunate enough to get two research fellowships in which I studied various branches of science and also the history of science, in order to see what were the criteria that people used for discarding old theories and adopting new theories. And I also studied, did graduate work in philosophy and a graduate course in theology. So in my first academic job, indeed for 10 years as a university teacher, I devoted my time almost entirely to the philosophy of science in order to understand the justification that people had for their scientific views. And I wrote two books which were relevant. The first one, Space and Time, obvious old philosophical topics, but taking into account and trying to analyze the relevance of theory of relativity to our understanding of these notions. And my second book, An Introduction to Confirmation Theory, was about what makes what probable. And I saw that the Bayesian theory of probability captured very well the criteria which scientists use. And so after 10 years, I began to apply these results to religious claims. And I wrote first The Coherence of Theism, which was an analysis of what it means to say that there is a God, and then The Existence of God, which studied the evidence for this, and I argued that the most general features of the universe made it probable that there is a God. And then the third volume of that trilogy was Faith and Reason, which considered the relevance of that to the practice of religion. And then I moved on, and I considered the particular detailed claims of the Christian religion. And I wrote a series of books concerned with the Christian doctrines of Christ's atonement, the doctrine that Christ had revealed certain truths, and also the account of the nature of God peculiar to Christianity, doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation. Of course, the major objection to all claims that there is a God is the existence of pain and suffering. And I did discuss that in The Existence of God, but I wrote a much fuller book on that. Then I turned to the what is the doctrine of human nature, or what religion needs in that respect. And I think that Christian doctrine, at any rate, needs the view that humans have free will, and that makes them morally responsible for their actions. And I also think that Christianity, if it is to make sense of the notion of life after death, needs to think of humans as consisting of two parts, body and soul. And so in recent years, I've devoted quite a lot of attention to these doctrines and produced 2 or 3 books on the subject. And there have been various other books, and also I have produced second editions of many of my books, because after 20 or 30 years, well, philosophy's moved on and I have to interact with it. Science has moved on and I have to interact with it. And to some extent, I've moved on and have to interact with it. And also I've produced 1 or 2 elementary expositions of my book views.
It's a remarkable arc, Richard, and we all, whether we believe in God or whether we believe in Christianity, it teaches a great deal about how to think about ultimate questions. The whole arc. Let me ask you this: just what has given you the most difficulties in this process, the most challenges that you had to wrestle with?
Well, I think anybody recognizes that the problem of evil, why is there suffering, is the most serious challenge to religious belief. And from time to time, I have interacted with that. As I say, I wrote a book called Providence and the Problem of Evil in the late 1990s. And it's a topic I've returned to because this year there was published a debate book between myself and Jim Sturber on this issue. And he argues traditionally that all the suffering in the world is not compatible with the existence of God, whereas I argue that it is compatible, that God should allow these things to occur. He gives us free will, and significant free will, so that we can choose between alternatives. And he gives us natural evils, diseases, accidents, and so on, which provide us with the opportunity to react in the right way, and so to form our own character. Of course, there's a lot more filling out, but that is the basic approach. But I continue to think about that. I think I'm right, but there it is.
Well, I think that's we're going to get to all of those topics as we discuss free will and the problem of evil in great depth. I'm just looking for an overview now. As you look back, are there any regrets that you have, that you might have done something sooner rather than later, or later rather than sooner? And what open issues do you see that still hang out there?
Oh, well, free will, I think, is an open issue. I think on a slight balance of probability, we've got free will, and I've got arguments for that. But that is, I think, in theory, at any rate, falsifiable by any scientific discoveries about the brain. I don't think it will be. I don't think there will be. I think it would not be practically possible for science to show that all our decisions on important matters are ones which we are not caused by preceding events to make. But in theory, it could be done. And I think that would be the most serious of all challenges.
Do you have any regrets in terms of something you should have done sooner rather than later, or later rather than sooner, or topics you would have liked to have covered as you look back on more than 60 years of remarkable work?
None of these, and a lot of topics I would like to cover further. and shall obviously not have time to do so.
Richard, you say that your natural theology, Arguments for the Probable Existence of God, uses the same criteria used in science and history to show that one hypothesis, is probable or more probable than some other hypothesis based on certain evidence. You ground this on epistemic justification. In other words, what constitutes the justification of a belief and what constitutes knowledge. You also say that Bayes' theorem captures these criteria correctly. Bayes' theorem assesses the probability of a cause given its effect. But does it make sense to ascribe exact numerical values to the probability of any scientific theory?
No, it doesn't, with exceptions. But when I say Bayes' theorem gives a correct account, what I must be understood as saying is that except for exceptional fillings, that is to say when certain probabilities are 1 or 0, what that means is that the theorems of relative probability derivable from Bayes' theorem are correct. That's to say, if it follows from Bayes' theorem that if one theory is more probable than another, it may follow from Bayes' theorem that one theory is more probable than another, or is very much more probable than another, or is more probable on this evidence than on that evidence. And you can get all of that from Bayes' theorem, even though you can't give exact values to the T components.
So it's more relative than absolute.
Yes, except in certain cases. I mean, for certain fillings, the probability of the evidence is 1, and for certain other theories, their probability is 0 because there's no theory and so on. But apart from those sort of cases, yes.
So the critical element and the unique element of Bayes' theorem is the concept of prior probabilities, what you would expect prior to the current evidence. How does that work? How do you assess prior probabilities of a hypothesis?
I think I'd better explain the theorem first,
Okay.
which you will see displayed. What it's concerned with is the probability of H, a hypothesis, on evidence, particular observations, and background evidence. And it gives a value to that. And the value is the product of 2 probabilities divided by a third one. That first probability is the probability of the evidence given the theory and given the background. That is to say, how probable it is that if the theory is true, you would find these bits of evidence. And of course, this is obviously the first criterion that any scientific theory or historical theory must satisfy. And the denominator, underneath, is the probability that you would get these bits of evidence anyway on the background, whether or not the hypothesis is true.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, a hypothesis isn't going to be made probable by evidence if it's pretty probable that you find the evidence anyway, whether or not it's true. And the third crucial element at the top is the probability of H, the hypothesis, on K, and K is the background evidence. Now, if we're considering a rather narrow theory, and Bayes' theorem is applicable, in my view, both to large-scale scientific theories like quantum theory, or, on the other hand, to tiny historical theories like John did the murder. If you're dealing with a narrow theory, and you can get these in science, a narrow theory, for example, about the structure of a certain substance, then you have to take into account more general knowledge of how the world works. In the case of the structure of a substance, you can't suddenly decide that it's made out of all sorts of atoms that no one had ever heard of before. And so you take back the ordinary background of chemistry, its results and so on. And if you are investigating who did the crime, you do have to take into account evidence apart from the evidence of whether of the clues left afterwards. You have to take into account whether the supposed criminal is a rogue based on his behavior, or whether he is an upstanding citizen. And more generally, you have to take into account, is this the sort of action that a human with his background would do or not? So you always have to take this sort of thing into account when you're dealing with a theory, which is a very narrow theory. But the wider theory, the theory is, and as you come up into science, into the hierarchy of sciences, clearly chemistry is a higher level theory than particular biological theories, and physics is a higher level theory than chemistry. And when you come to the most general of all theories, quantum theory or relativity theory, or associated with them, theories of the four forces, then there is nothing outside their scope, because they try and explain almost everything. And certainly when you come to the existence of God, there is nothing outside the scope. Mm-hmm. So how do we judge the probability of the hypothesis on zero background evidence? And the answer is, we think that the simplest theory is the most probable theory. And all science exemplifies that. Whether it takes into account background evidence of a substantial kind or not. Because if you only took into account whether the hypothesis is such as to make it probable to observe the evidence, and whether the hypothesis is such that it would occur anyway, there are always an infinite number of possible theories compatible with these hypotheses.
Yeah.
You can illustrate that with a simple example. Suppose you're starting to study how the volume of a gas is dependent on its pressure, or its pressure is dependent on its volume. And you have in front of you a graph on which you measure pressure at one axis and volume on another, and you plot for various gases what is the value of the pressure when the volume is this, when the volume is that, what is its pressure, and so on. And you can mark with a little cross on the graph where the places are. And so the theory must be such that it relates these by a curve which passes through these points. But an infinite number of curves will pass through different finite number of points, and they'll diverge widely. And any scientific theory you like to take, it's very easy to devise a hypothesis which yields the data. And of course, when we are studying present events, it's very easy to construct a hypothesis which is a very complicated hypothesis to explain who killed President Kennedy or whatever. But if the hypothesis is a complicated one, that counts against it. It is revealed as arbitrary. And simplicity is the crucial criterion.
But it is not the case that the most simplest is always correct. The quote attributed to Einstein, whether he said or not, I'm not sure, is make a theory as simple as possible, but not simpler. because certainly relativity theory to some people is not a simple theory in one sense, but it is a very simple theory in another sense. So it's an articulation between the simplicity and what the evidence and what the theory is really all about.
Oh, yes, certainly. Some frequently, as it were, the simplest theory proves not to be compatible with the evidence. And in the case of the relation of the pressure and volume of a gas, it was shown that there's a much more complicated relation between them than pressure times volume equals a constant. The simplest theory is sometimes not the most probable. All that Bayes' theorem claims is that other things being equal, the simplest theory is most probable. But simplicity only enters when we're talking about the prior probability of a theory, and that is its probability on background evidence. And if the background evidence is zero, then its probability on background evidence is simply the degree of its simplicity. Now, simple theories sometimes yield bad predictions, in which case you must discard them, and that is allowed by the theorem because the first term on the right-hand side says just that. That has often happened to scientific theories in the history of science. Kepler was replaced by Newton because Newton's theory made a much wider set of predictions than Kepler and wasn't necessarily much less complicated. And Newton's theory has been replaced by Einstein's theory. And Einstein's theory is a bit more complicated, but the point is that it can make predictions that Newton's theory couldn't. And so we have to weigh these three items on the right-hand side of the equation against each other. And sometimes the less simple theory turns out to be more probable. But we can never be certain we've got the right theory because new evidence may turn up incompatible with it. In that case, we have to cope with that by going to the next simple theory and so on.
Richard, you call your book, The Existence of God, the central book of all that you have written in the philosophy of religion. It is surely your most well-known work. It seeks to reestablish natural theology by providing probabilistic arguments from the general features of the world to the existence of God. Yet, as we know, natural theology is broadly out of favor among most philosophers and certainly almost all scientists who dismiss natural theology as pre-Darwinian and archaic. So, Richard, what's the background of the book? What was your motivation in the drafting initially of the first edition of The Existence of God?
Well, my motivation was because I thought that in the coming religious climate, which I foresaw and which has subsequently developed, the coming intellectual climate, I should mean, religion was becoming less popular. People believed it was an out of date way of looking at the universe, and I thought, therefore, that one needed arguments to show that that was not the case. And I had always admired, to some moderate extent, natural theology as done by the patristics, that's to say the early Christian theologians, and the later medieval theologians who were always producing arguments for the existence of God. It's been part of the Christian tradition and indeed the Islamic tradition from the beginning. But medievals in particular, the Western medievals, assumed that the arguments must be conclusive deductive arguments. That's to say, a deductive argument would be one that draws out from the premises a conclusion to which you are inevitably committed. by the premises. And so you had arguments of the form, every event in time must have a cause, and therefore, if there is to be a cause of such an event, it must lie outside time. Well, yes, that might be true, but I can't see any very general reason for believing it to be true. So it seemed to me that the structure of an argument for the existence of God must be a probabilistic rather than a deductive one. And in fact, one can get, there are arguments among the earlier Christian fathers which are in fact probabilistic, though they don't use that apparatus. It's the medievals, though, had this great preference for strict deductive arguments. Well, that was my task, to recast natural theology in a probabilistic way. And it seemed to me that Bayes' theorem in particular captured the criteria which are used in science and history. That is, that a theory is more probably true insofar as it predicts the observations, insofar as the observations are not to be expected in the normal course of things, and insofar as it is a simple theory. And so I considered the kind of phenomena from which medievals argued to the existence of God, and I considered whether those phenomena, which are the most general features of the universe, were such as to be what you would expect if the theory was true, that there is a God is true, such as you wouldn't expect in the normal course of things, and is a simple theory. And so the most general phenomena which I considered were, firstly, that there is a large physical universe at all, and then the fact that it is governed by simple laws of nature. And it depends much how you, this argument does depend a bit on how you understand a law of nature. For example, Newton's law of gravity, that all bodies attract each other with forces of a certain proportion. And it seemed to me that it's not correct to think of laws as sort of independent of the objects which they influence. And so the best way to construe this is to say that all substances, all objects, material objects in the universe, have the power to attract other objects with certain forces and the liability of doing so. And given that, this second piece of evidence is the piece of evidence that every atom, every tiny particle of the universe has the same powers and liabilities. And that is a most extraordinary thing. And then my third piece of evidence is not merely that, but that the laws of nature, so interpreted, are productive of human bodies. You could have very simple laws of nature governing every atom in the universe without the possibility of them coming together in such a way as to form human bodies. And fourthly, I consider the fact that some of the inhabitants of the universe are conscious beings, and nothing in science so far has ever got anywhere near explaining how that could happen. And I have theoretical reasons to suppose that the only way that could happen would be by complicating the laws of nature enormously in order to do that. So we have these phenomena, and I argue, if there is a God of the traditional kind, perfectly good, he would want to create beings like us, because we are good things, and we share the characteristic of God in a tiny way. We know things, we have knowledge, we have powers, we can do things, and we have moral beliefs. And we can make differences to the world, therefore. And that's a good thing. And so those are one of the things, and in particular, the better sort of thing that God could create. So we would expect there to be human beings. But the four phenomena which I have noted are necessary for the existence of human beings. Unless there's a universe, you can't have human beings. Unless it's governed by simple laws of nature, then whatever a human being does, he would have no idea what difference it would make. We know that if we light a fire and put certain fruits from the garden in it, then it will cook those fruits. Or if we have a fire and put it in a different place, it will burn the enemy's crops. And so we know how to produce effects because we know what we have to do in order to feed ourselves or alternatively to hurt the enemy. And that we know that is only but one example. Of course, everything we do with our bodies, and we won't know what to do with our bodies to produce an effect unless we know regularities about what effects produce what. And for that, you need simple enough regularities for humans to understand. So that's the second piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence is, of course, if we are to exist at all with bodies, the universe must have certain special characteristics. This is often brought out in modern terms by pointing out that the universe is fine-tuned, that is to say, the various forces which act have to have values, have to have constants, that is to say, some force is produced by a constant times some feature of the universe, have to have constants within very narrow limits. For example, the gravitational force, which influences how bodies attract each other, has the form, the force equals g, the gravitational constant, multiplied by the mass of each body, divided by the square of their distance apart. And that measures the force exerted by one body on another body. But that value g has to be very specific in order to allow human bodies to evolve. And what goes for that goes for all the other constants involved. And the values have to lie within very, very tiny limits, 1 in a trillion or things of that order. And this is known as the fine-tuning of the universe. And fourthly, of course, humans need to be conscious. So you'd expect the universe to have these characteristics if there is a God. If there isn't a God, you certainly wouldn't expect there to be this. Why should there be a large universe, especially one in which everything behaves in the same way, and especially one which is geared to the production of human beings, let alone one which is geared to the production of conscious beings? So Bayes' theory is satisfied in these two respects, that the hypothesis, theism, that there is a God, leads you to expect the evidence, and the evidence such as you wouldn't expect anyway, and for reasons that I've given, which I can give, it's a simple hypothesis.
Why is it the case that you believe that the existence of God is a simple hypothesis? Many atheists criticize the concept of God because it adds another complexity to the universe, exactly the opposite of a simplistic explanation.
Well, yes, but all of physics adds extra complexities to the data which they explain. You could have, and science did have until the beginning of the 19th century, a physics simply about the relation of observables to other observables. But with the coming of the atomic theory of chemistry at the beginning of the 19th century, they were postulating extra entities. And this was the right thing to do, so long as these extra entities led you to expect, to make probable, the existence of everything observed so far. So all of science is involved in postulating extra entities, so long as it makes what you observe to be expected, and so long as it's simple.
And then how do you apply that to the existence of God? Why then is God a simple explanation?
Well, I regard a simple explanation as one which postulates few entities, few things, few kinds of entities, few properties possessed by things, few kinds of properties, mathematically simple relations between these properties, to postulate God is to postulate one entity, not many. If you don't have God, then your starting point is many entities, all the entities in the world. But if you can explain them by one entity which causes them to exist, then that is a very simple explanation. This entity has one very simple property of being essentially everlastingly omnipotent, and I believe all the other divine properties can be deduced from that. Most of the things we observe in the universe have rather complicated lots of properties, or doesn't. And the properties we ascribe to God are mathematically simple, because being everlasting is having zero limits of life before and after. Being omnipotent is a matter of having zero limits to power, and zero is a very simple number.
Okay, let's go into some of the specific arguments. We can't do all of them, but just to get your overarching sense of the structure. And as you mentioned, you begin with the cosmological argument, the existence of the universe, then the teleological or design argument, fine-tuning, the order, then human beings with consciousness, morality, and then you add other chapters on other kinds of evidence, the evidence of providence, history and miracles, religious experience that different believing groups would point to. Of this panoply of different kinds of evidence for the existence of God in your view, which do you favor or give more weight to in developing your overall probabilistic conclusion that it's more probable than not that there is a God?
Well, the four I have mentioned so far are, I think, the crucial ones, the most general features of the universe. And I should also add that I take into account one general feature, that is to say that there is a lot of pain and suffering. And I argue that that doesn't count against, because it is not unexpected, given that there is a God. But when you come to the other bits of evidence, some people have an argument from morality, that there wouldn't be any morality unless there was a God. That seems to me false. I have a duty to keep my promises whether or not there's a God. So that argument has to be restructured a bit. What is not to be expected unless there is a God is that human beings are morally conscious. They're aware of moral truths. And you might not expect that if there wasn't a God. But I don't think that's a very strong argument, but I think it's a modest argument. Likewise, you might not expect humans to be conscious of the existence of God, as many of them are and have been in history, unless there's a God. But I don't see that very strong. There might be other than awareness of his presence which causes them to have these beliefs. And then many people have religious experiences, and I think that's quite a powerful argument. It seems to many people that they are aware of the presence of God, and it's always rational to believe that things are as they seem to be if you don't have counter evidence. That's a bit stronger, but I think the four features I mentioned are really the strongest.
How have your views or arguments changed over time? The second editions of your major books are really important, actually historical documents to memorialize your own changes over sometimes 2 decades or so. So, In the Existence of God, the second edition, which is a wonderful book, what are some of the changes in that reflect your changes since the original version?
Well, I don't think there are any major changes. I have sort of restructured things a bit and made them more precise and taken account of the criticisms that have been made. I mean, one example is scientists, many of them, favor what's known as a multiverse theory. The theory that our universe was produced by an enormous soup of matter energy. It was thrown up by that, but the soup of matter energy has the power and liability to throw up different universes at different times. And these different universes might well have different laws of nature and different constants, so perhaps it's not so surprising that our universe has the laws of nature and the constants it does. I think there are pretty quick answers to that, but it became very fashionable. And the quick answers are, well, to start with, nobody's ever produced a successful multiverse theory. And secondly, even if they had, the multiverse itself would have to have certain characteristics in order to produce at some time a universe which was fine-tuned for the production of humans. Because innumerable logically possible multiverses will never throw up such a universe. So the problem just moves one stage back. So I don't think that sort of damages the argument at all. But I mean, I discussed it at some length in the book.
So you get two kinds of criticism as to categories. Some believers, maybe Christian believers, say that evidence of God should be personal and not subject to the criteria of science and history and Bayesian probabilities. On the other hand, some non-believers dismiss the probabilities that you assign to the evidence. So very quickly, how do you respond to each of these rather diametrically opposite criticisms?
Well, I'm very happy with the idea that some people are justified in believing that there's a God on the basis of their personal experience, their awareness. And some people are justified in believing there's a God because that's what the people that they trust most tell them. It's always rational to believe what people who you trust rather than people you don't. But in the modern world, I don't think too many people are in this situation because both of these principles are subject to the qualification in the absence of counter evidence. Believe what it seems to be the case to you unless you've got evidence to the contrary. Trust certain informants unless you have evidence to the contrary. And in the modern world, most people are aware of evidence to the contrary. Claim traditional arguments against the existence of God, arguments to show that nobody can prove it, and so on and so forth. And this is the case far more in our century and the previous century than in many earlier centuries, not in all earlier centuries. I think, for example, in the Western, in the Roman Empire, in the 4th and 5th century, everything went, as it were. Christianity, all sorts of religions were in competition with each other and with atheism. And so everything went. But in the intervening period of the Western Middle Ages, there was a consensus that there was a God, and therefore most people weren't aware of objections. But we are aware of objections, and many people are convinced by them. And so the modern world needs natural theology more than most eras.
Does it bother you that in a survey of 1,700 professional philosophers, less than 20% accept or lean towards theism, while about two-thirds, 67%, accept or lean toward atheism?
Well, of course, it bothers me in a sense. I think they're mistaken, and uh, um, I'd like them to consider the arguments a little more seriously. But all good theories are unfashionable at some time, and some good theories are perhaps never fashionable. But I think people should consider the evidence, and I'm prepared to argue with any philosopher, as you probably know, about these matters. And what I do think is the case is that most philosophers recognize that the sort of arguments I give um, make philosophy of religion a discipline that they can see the point of.
That's a good point.
In my student days, when ordinary language philosophy and logical positivism were fashionable, the typical philosophy attitude was, well, that's just not a serious thing we should be considering. Um, Whereas I use the categories that philosophers are very familiar with: substances, properties, time, evidence, justification, belief, and so on. They know these categories, and therefore they can see that the sort of arguments I give use the apparatus they are talking in terms of in philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and so on. And they, for that reason, I think, are interested in it and can take it seriously, even if they are not convinced by it.
Yeah, excellent. I agree with that. Final question. What about Alvin Plantinga's idea that belief in the existence of God is what he called properly basic, that we don't need arguments, just like we don't need arguments if we believe in the existence of other minds or the existence of the past, we sort of naturally accept that.
Well, our Plantinga may not need arguments, but I'm considering other people as well. And all he really claims, as he would admit, is that I, Alvin Plantinga, are epistemically justified in believing that there is a God. And I agree with him. He is. He has an awareness of the presence of God, and it seems obvious to him. But and as I said, many people have religious experiences, and are therefore, or some people have religious experiences deep enough for them to feel that it's obvious they're true. And I'm happy with that. But most people aren't in that situation, and they do need arguments, therefore. And I think Al, in the end, has admitted that.
Richard, you agree that the problem of evil may provide a good argument against theism, but your opponents claim that the occurrence of evil provides a stronger argument against the existence of God than you are willing to allow. So, what enables you to limit the power of evil to refute the existence of God?
Yes, I don't say that it's any evidence for the existence of God. I just say it's not significant evidence against the existence of God. And that requires me to produce a theodicy. That is an account of why God would have allowed the evils of this world to occur. Evils are normally divided into two kinds: moral evils and natural evils. Moral evils are the ones, either deliberately or through negligence, brought about by humans, and natural evils are things like droughts and famines and earthquakes and diseases and so on, which are not brought about by humans. But some of them may be allowed to occur as a result of human negligence, but clearly most of them are not so allowed. Right. Natural evil. Let's start with moral evils. I think God's greatest gift to humans is the gift of free will. A limited free will. Of course, we have only a range of choice for each of us that we can make, but all the same, free will. This is a contentious philosophical issue, but we can't discuss it here, and I think it's an unresolved one. But I think the balance in this case is just about in favor of us having what is called libertarian free will. That is, free will to act independently of the causes acting upon us. Those causes may influence us, but they do not determine our actions. In that case, it's up to us what we do, and that's a great gift. But it wouldn't be very much of a great gift if the only choices were the choices that God approved of. If God is to give us real freedom to make a difference to things, he has to allow us the freedom to make a difference either for good or for evil. And in that way, he makes us what I have called mini creators. That is to say, we can make differences for good or ill to ourselves, to other people, and to the world. And that's a great gift. But of course, we may choose badly. And if we choose badly, then other people are going to suffer. And that is the initial reason why God allows such suffering, for the sake of the other people who have the choice of whether or not to bring it about. But it's also a choice for sufferers too, because sufferers do have a choice. If somebody is nasty to you, then you have a choice of either thinking to yourself, well, he can't help it, he was brought up that way, he's really nice after all, and so on. And to take a more different sort of example, if I get ill and other people aren't not nice to me, they just ignore me, they don't help, they say it's his own fault, I have the opportunity to not to hold it against them. Okay, so in this process of allowing us to have choices for good or ill, we don't merely have the immediate effect, but we gradually affect our own character, because each time you make a good choice, it becomes easier to make a good choice of that sort next time. And each time you make a bad choice, it becomes easier to make a bad choice of that sort. And so we form our own characters by our choices. We form our own characters, whether we are the victims of others or whether our suffering is brought about by natural causes. And so we have this great opportunity to make ourselves, as well as the world and other people, for good or ill. Now, some people may think, well, God doesn't have the right to do this sort of thing. But of course he does. And we can see that by the fact that although God is our greatest benefactor, he causes us to exist and keeps us in being, and provides all the good things that this world has, we have two sorts of human benefactors who also benefit us: our parents and the state. We are our parents, and I'm talking not just about biological parents, but parents who care for us through our childhood years. They clearly impose on us suffering for a good cause. Suffering consists in having happen to you what you don't like to have happen, and parents are generally thought to have the right to do that, to send people to school when they don't want to go to school, even to send someone to a neighborhood school that they don't want to go to for the sake of others. And in these Parents have the right to stop their children going on particular holidays abroad or associating with other people, particular other people. All that for the sake of the child, and one of them, things I mentioned, for the sake of others as well. And if parents have the right to impose on us limited suffering, then surely the God who is responsible for the existence of the parents and all that they can do and all that we can do has a much greater right. Likewise, the state, we owe our security and the fact that we are not living in a Wild West situation and can grow up peacefully to the state. And the state has the great rights over us. It imposes taxes on us we don't want to pay, but it imposes other things too. And I think the greatest example of that is when the country is fighting a just war. The state has the right to conscript people, and that is to impose the serious danger of suffering and death on them. So if parents and the state, who are rather limited benefactors, have the right to impose on us suffering for a good cause, then surely God has the right to impose on us suffering for a good cause. And the good cause in which parents and the state have the right to impose on us, and so a fortiori God does too, is not merely for our own sake, but also sometimes for the sake of others, as when, with my example, when parents send their children to a neighborhood school that the child doesn't want to go to in order to cement relations in the community. It's not done for the child's benefit, but for the sake of the community. And likewise, when the state conscripts people, it's not principally for the benefit of those conscripted who could easily get out of the way and go abroad, but for the sake of those older and weaker people whom they are defending. And so, if the state can do this, God can do a lot more to us in the way of making us suffer, if it is the only way in which a particular benefit can be given to us or to someone else.
How do you factor in the amount of evil, the clear enormity of gratuitous evil in the world?
Well, the two conditions which limit a parent and the state's right to impose evils are, first, that it's for the benefit of the person who suffers or someone else, but secondly, the very fact that they are and remain benefactors. That is to say, if the parents have to, for example, cause a baby to have a painful injection for the sake of the baby surviving, then in a war situation, say when there are no anesthetics, then that is only something the parent has the right to do, and the parent has the right to do because the parent will continue to provide a life for that baby, and so, as it were, the parent will compensate by the good life the parent provides for the baby, by so that on the whole the baby's life is good. Well, the same applies to God. If God imposes us much more serious evils, as you rightly suggest, he has, as it were, to be on balance our benefactor. And he's able to do that in a way that parents and the state aren't, because if we are caused to suffer in a big way, then he can compensate us with a life after death in which, as it were, outweighs by a long way the horror involved.
The argument that evil does not count significantly against the existence of God is related to what you need is a life after death. to make the compensation more than appropriate for the evil suffered.
Yes, that is true. I mean, in many cases, in most cases, if people do suffer, on the whole, their earthly life is good anyway, on balance. But in certain cases, it clearly isn't. But the second point I wish to make is God wishes us to form our own character. And this own character that he would wish us to form isn't just being fairly good people or moderately, more than that. He would want us to make us saints. And this means that he would like us, by our own choices, to make ourselves really dedicated to the good, dedicated to helping people, dedicated to doing the right thing by everybody, including God, and to enjoy doing it. And that's not something that many of us have really reached by the end of our lives, but that is clearly what God would hope for. And you can see that by asking yourself the question, what on earth was the point of God creating us? Was the point of God creating us to put us in a fairly comfortable world where there weren't any serious evils, so that we didn't have the choice of making ourselves saints, and then at the end letting us die? Surely not. God would want us to become saints. He would want us to become saints through our own choice. But we can only become saints if we force ourselves to be good, really good, to do the right thing, such as sacrifice our own life or our own well-being for the sake of others, and to like to do that. That's what the saints like. And that's what's worth keeping alive forever, because only people who are that sort of people would enjoy the life of heaven as it is pictured by Christian writers. And at the other end, also crucially, if somebody makes bad choices, bad choices, bad choices, they are gradually eliminating their moral sensitivity. That is to say, if they do a bad act and feel a bit bad about it, but nevertheless do an even worse act next time, they gradually lose the sense that any act is morally good, because to recognize an act as morally good is to have some inclination to do it. And one gets the feeling that some of the nastiest SS guards in the war had simply eliminated their moral sense. And God would allow someone to choose not to be the sort of person that God wanted them to be. That is what parents do in a modest way. That is to say, they would like their children to be good children, but nevertheless, they don't force them to be good children. They allow them to make bad choices within limits. But God, being God, who can have far greater rights over us and far greater possibilities for us in the afterlife, would also further like to give us the choice of actually rejecting everything he stands for. The comparison I make is to a suitor. The suitor is can ask the beloved she will marry him, and the beloved has the right to say no, and the suitor has the right to ask again and again. But the suitor does not have the right to ask an infinite number of times. One must take no for an answer. In that case, the suitor must take no for an answer. God must take no for an answer. And so he gives people the choice of totally rejecting God. But that will only come if they have the choice of producing a horrendous evil. Ordinary bad people have a bit of conscience about certain minor things, and that can, as it were, be built up. If they choose to do the right thing, then they will become better. But if they've made themselves totally evil, they can't choose the right thing anymore. but that's their choice. So the horrendous evils, which are not so horrendous if you consider the afterlife situation, are allowed by God to happen in order that we may make ourselves not merely fairly good or fairly bad people, but saints or very evil people. And it's very good for us that we have that significant choice, but it can only be ours if the choices before us are big, serious choices.
Okay, Richard, what I'd like to do now is just ask a few very pointed questions and get very short answers. So, number one, how do you weight the argument from evil against the existence of God with your various arguments for the existence of God? You talk about cosmological argument, the design argument, teleological, religious experience, miracles, providence, the nature of consciousness, morality. There's a whole series of different arguments for the existence of God. So how do you weight the argument from evil?
Well, I weight it as neither, possibly a bit against, but not seriously against, for the reasons I've given. It is really a development of the argument from providence. The argument from providence is God gives us many choices of making a difference to the world, but it has to. But if he's to give us serious choices, then it's when evil may arise.
What about animal pain and suffering during the hundreds of millions of years of evolution? If there is a God, I think we'd say God created evolution. That's a whole other subject, of course. Does animal pain and suffering count as a part of the argument from evil against God?
Well, it depends on which animals suffer and how much they suffer. And
Well,
we don't know that.
getting eaten alive is suffering, I would think, for virtually every animal.
Well, I'm not so sure of that.
Okay.
Though you are come from a neurological background, I think that there is no good reason at all to suppose that anything below the rank of vertebrates has pain. Of course, they avoid noxic dangers, but as you know, in human beings, when we are subject to bodily damage, there are two nerve channels, one of which leads to our aversive behavior, running away, pulling away the hand which has touched the hot plate, and the other of which goes to the brain and causes our pain. Now, you can have one without the other, and the mere fact that fish don't like things that sting them doesn't show that the fish feels pain at all. It just because that fish may only have the aversive reaction.
Sure, but vertebrates.
The question is which animals have goings on in their brain which causes pain, and my understanding is that in human beings, the nerve cells in the brain which cause pain are in the prefrontal cortex, which the animals, invertebrates, don't have. And indeed, my information is mammals don't have any seriousness. It's only the higher animals, if I may use this word, who do feel pain.
There's certainly a great deal of higher vertebrates at whatever level you want to say that have suffered pain. So let me ask this.
I do know that.
Well, I mean, how do I know that you suffer pain if you touch a
because I have that in my brain, and you have in your brain you have in your brain the same things that are the same parts that I have in my brain.
Sure. I think
the issue arises as to whether creatures that don't have the same parts in their brain feel pain.
Sure.
And the mere fact that they feel aversion doesn't show that. I'm not saying, I'm just saying certain, only that the higher animals and that feel pain. And I have reason to suppose that they don't feel nearly as much as us, because the parts of the, in the chimpanzee, for example, the prefrontal cortex, which is our nearest relative, the prefrontal cortex is a third of the size that it is in us. So, okay, so they don't feel, if I'm right, and I agree this is a controversial matter, and I don't think it's going to be solved very well at all, because animals don't talk, and how can we know, and so on. But the limited evidence I've seen and the limited papers I've read on this suggest that. Okay, so why do they suffer at all? Well, there's a point I didn't mention in connection with humans, that although doing the right thing, voluntary, freely, is good, it's in a more limited way good for us if we are made to do a good thing, even though we haven't chosen to do it. I mean, prisoners, if prisoners are made to clean the sewers, that's far better for them, because they're doing some good to others, than if they are just made to break up rocks for no good purpose at all. Okay, and also, if people suffer not through their own fault or anything like that, or just as a result of accidents, that's good not merely for the choices it gives to others and so on, but it's good for them that what happens to them is a benefit to others. For example, if someone is badly maimed or killed in a railway accident, what his relatives say is, this is terrible, but thank goodness it served some good purpose, because it led to a reform of the system and so on. Now, bearing that point in mind, I don't think animals have free will, but they nevertheless, their pain is a cause of it. If their suffering can, not through their choice or through anyone else's choice, be a benefit to others. The most conspicuous example of that is where the mother of some offspring tries to decoy predators by exposing herself, and in order that she may suffer, and they get away. Now, that's a great benefit for her, that her life has been of use in saving the offspring, even though it's going to, doing so is going to lead to her death and pain on the way. And I think that applies fairly generally to animals, that they do useful things, and that pain is involved in that. And their useful things, their good actions, is a great benefit for other animals and themselves. They know that something happening to them is going to is causing them pain and will cause them more pain. But they run away. They save their own lives, not merely the lives of others whom they decoy, and that is good for them, that they can benefit themselves. And the pain provides an opportunity for them to benefit themselves and to benefit others, and that's good, so long as it's not too much pain. If it's too much pain, then it'd have to be, free will would have to be involved, but it doesn't always have to be involved.
So, is there any amount of evil, any amount of pain and suffering for humans or others that could empower the argument from evil to refute God's existence? Any amount?
Yes, certainly. But note in the human case, for example, that human life is very short. And if we suffer too much pain, we just die. So in the scale of eternity, it's a pretty small amount. If it was a lot more and for a lot longer period, I would be unhappy. I mean, I wouldn't think the argument was as strong.
Good. I remember in one of our earlier conversations about evil, you said something that sounds simple, but is actually very profound, that God did not create a toy world.
Yeah.
And to me, that sounds like a superficial answer, but it's actually a quite deep and a profound thought.
Well, thank you. That is what I was being saying with regard to the horrendous evils. Um, God and someone else has used the phrase that God wouldn't create a moral kindergarten.
Richard, the hiddenness of God is said to count against the existence of God, developed notably by John Schellenberg, whom I believe you supervised for his DPhil degree at Oxford. If it's the case that God keeps hidden to enable character to be built better, what can you, how can you justify that some people don't see God and therefore may do things that are inappropriate?
There's a number of points in connection with hiddenness. Schellenberg's point is that many people who seriously try and find out whether there's a God are convinced on rational grounds that there isn't a God, and they never had an experience of them. And so Schellenberg argues a good father wouldn't treat his children like that. He would make himself known to them. And against that, I make 2 points. The first point is that if we all believed that there was a God, no one would have the opportunity to help other people to believe that there's a God. Many people come to believe that there's a God because other people help them to do that, and other people have the choice of whether or not to help them. So the agnostics' loss is often due to other people rather than themselves, and that is one of the free choices in this world. And it's good that we have the opportunity to help others in this respect. And the second point is, if we all knew that there was a God, and we're pretty certain of it, and we all knew that the good go to heaven and the bad don't, we wouldn't have very much temptation, the sort of temptation we in fact have, to do the bad, because we know that we will be punished for it. And I think God is looking for people who want to do the good because it's good, even though, of course, he will be greatly pleased that they do it. And there is a point in agnosticism being around and serious arguments against the existence of God being around, even though, of course, I think they don't work, in order to make there be some doubt about it. And that is helps people to do the good for the sake of the good. And a further point is, of course, that given life after death, the unavailability of God to some is only an inability in this life. And I can't see, given that there's life after death, why it has to come in, why God's making himself known to everybody has to come in this short period of our earthly life.
Does it then follow that all those people who do not build sufficient character during their current lives and therefore do not attain heaven or whatever the ultimate reward is, that none of those people would have fared better had God been open and obvious? Because if those people who did not qualify in this life would have qualified if God were more open and obvious, that would seem to counter the argument that God's hiddenness is a benefit, not a liability.
I didn't say it's a benefit. That is to say, it's an equally good situation that he would make himself known, for obvious reasons. But if he doesn't make himself known, there is this other benefit that I pointed to. God gives different benefits to different people. One's not better or worse than the other. But if some people are ignorant, others can help them to see God. If others fail, then in virtue of other considerations, I don't think God sends them to hell. He gives them another chance.
Many thanks, Richard. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I learned some. I can't tell you I am a believer in all aspects of Christian theology, but I am a great believer in the kinds of explanations that you give, which I think are wonderful. Viewers can watch Richard Swinburne's more than 70 videos and 36 Closer to Truth TV episodes, as well as over 1,000 videos on philosophy of religion and philosophical theology on the Closer to Truth website and Closer to Truth YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.